How could a small desert bean have more protein than beef and survive 110-degree heat without water? For 5,000 years, native farmers called it their life seed. Then it vanished from fields, erased by imported crops and colonial pride. Now scientists are shocked. It could outlive corn, soy, and maybe even us. But who buried its name? Before meat became the symbol of strength, a small desert bean carried the same power: more protein than beef, more iron than spinach, and more endurance than corn. Archaeologists still uncover its seeds in clay pots buried for over 1,000 years, proof that this crop once fed entire civilizations from Mexico to the Great Plains. Some of these seeds remain intact, so well preserved that scientists could still test their nutrition. The results stunned them. The protein concentration rivals modern soy, and the mineral density is higher than most multivitamins on the market. Early journals from Spanish explorers mention this mystery bean being traded in baskets along desert routes. It fueled journeys across hundreds of miles, thriving in regions where no other crop could survive. It carried energy, healing, and a sense of spiritual connection to the land. To the tribes who grew it, it wasn't just food, it was identity. Then, over centuries, it simply vanished. No record in colonial archives, no mention in modern farming guides. A crop powerful enough to rival meat disappeared as if it had never existed. So what happened? Why did something this valuable vanish so completely from our memory? Scientists didn't rediscover its name until the late 1900s, tucked away in native seed libraries and oral traditions. It had a name, tepary bean, or Phaseolus acutifolius, and it was waiting to be remembered. And once you meet this plant's story, the mystery deepens even more. Long before supermarkets and fertilizer trucks, native farmers grew a seed that handled the desert like it was made for it. The tepary bean, known scientifically as Phaseolus acutifolius, thrived under the brutal Sonoran sun, heat over 110 degrees Fahrenheit, weeks without rain, and soil that cracked like pottery. Yet it grew anyway. Archaeologists found traces of it in hearths and storage pits dating back 5,000 years, showing how deep its roots ran through the Southwest. Tribes such as the Tohono O'odham, Pima, and Hopi built entire food systems around it. The bean didn't just feed people, it built resilience. When corn and squash failed, tepary survived. When drought swept through villages, this small, tough crop held on. Nutritionally, it outperformed nearly everything else. Each handful carried about 25% protein, double that of corn, and 3 times more fiber than the pinto bean most of us eat today. It was so efficient, it fixed its own nitrogen, feeding the soil as it grew. Native traders carried sacks of tepary beans across hundreds of miles, linking villages from Mexico to the Great Plains. European explorers called it a poor man's crop. Yet, centuries later, scientists realized it was smarter than modern agriculture. This was food built for endurance, not profit. It didn't depend on irrigation, fertilizer, or favor. It simply adapted and kept going. But then came colonization, and with it, an idea that reshaped food forever. The story of the tepary bean's disappearance has less to do with nature and everything to do with power. When Spanish colonists arrived in the Southwest during the 1600s, they didn't just bring horses and steel. They brought their crops and their idea of what civilized food looked like. Wheat, barley, and lentils soon filled the missions. Native fields growing tepary beans were replaced or burned to make room for the European diet. The tepary had fed people for thousands of years, yet colonists saw it as backward. One Jesuit missionary even wrote in his 1694 journal that the crop was too wild to control. That line says everything. To them, a plant that grew without irrigation or dependence was a threat because it didn't fit their systems of ownership. Over time, forced conversions and new trade rules shifted entire diets. Native farmers were told to plant wheat for church tithes, while their resilient bean fell out of use. The irony? Those European crops failed during long droughts, while the tepary could have kept them alive. Archaeological layers from that era show charred wheat husks beside dried tepary pods, two worlds crossing paths, one erased by pride. However, the desert never forgot. Seeds stayed buried in the soil, sleeping through centuries. And when modern agriculture started to struggle again, those seeds quietly waited for their turn to rise. That turn came during one of the hottest decades on record, and what scientists found changed everything. By the 1970s, global droughts started hitting crops hard. Soybeans dropped in yield, corn struggled to pollinate, and even wheat showed weakness under heat. Farmers in the American Southwest were desperate. That's when agricultural researchers began testing wild plants that still thrived in desert soil. What they found surprised everyone: a vine with small white blossoms, growing strong at 115 degrees Fahrenheit. They tested it in plots near Tucson and Sonora. Even with almost no irrigation, it produced a full crop. The plant turned out to be the tepary bean, alive and well after being forgotten for nearly 4 centuries. Its roots ran deep, its pods ripened fast, and its yield stayed consistent when others failed. Scientists measured nitrogen levels in the soil after harvest and found them higher than before planting. The plant literally healed the dirt it grew in. Dr. Howard Scott, a USDA researcher, called it a gift from the past to the future. The team compared it to soybeans. The tepary gave 20 to 25% protein, resisted pests naturally, and needed 1/3 the water. Farmers began to notice. Small desert gardens started experimenting again with old seeds found in tribal storage jars. Every test showed the same thing. It wasn't a weak relic. It was a survivor designed for extremes. However, survival alone doesn't guarantee a comeback. What happened next exposed how modern farming measures success. When lab results came back, researchers had to double-check the numbers. A single cup of tepary beans carried more protein than a serving of beef, nearly 25 grams per 100 grams of beans. It also had 3 times more calcium than milk and more iron than spinach. For a plant that grew wild in desert sand, that made no sense until they looked closer. Its secret was efficiency. The tepary packed nutrients densely because it adapted to scarcity. Every seed was a small vault of survival, storing what the land refused to give. Modern diets rely on soy and beef, both heavy on water use and cost. But the tepary gave more nutrition per drop of water than almost any modern crop. In a region where heat now kills most vegetables, this bean thrived with almost none. Doctors studying native health noticed something else. Among the Tohono O'odham people who reintroduced tepary beans into their diets, blood sugar levels dropped. Research in the early 2000s linked it to better insulin response and lower heart disease risk. The bean, once dismissed as poor food, began showing up in nutrition journals as a superfood. Yet even with science proving its worth, grocery stores stayed silent. There was no profit in growing something that asked for nothing. However, while companies looked away, a small group of native farmers decided this story wasn't over, and they planted history back into the soil. The tepary bean had everything big agriculture claimed to want: high yield, drought resistance, and natural soil recovery. But there was one problem: it refused to belong to anyone. You couldn't patent it, modify it, or sell expensive fertilizer alongside it. It didn't need them, and that made it invisible in a system built around control. By the 1980s, American farming had shifted to industrial monocrops like soy and corn, both subsidized by government programs. These crops fed livestock, not people, yet they shaped the economy. A plant like the tepary didn't fit. It grew too easily, demanded too little, and yielded food directly for humans. There was no corporate ladder to climb with it. Companies couldn't sell pesticides or irrigation systems for a plant that already thrived on neglect. Agricultural journals labeled it unsuitable for commercial production, even while research papers praised its climate strength. In simpler terms, it wasn't profitable, and profit beat survival every time. Meanwhile, desert farmers watched their soil harden and their water disappear. The tepery could have solved both problems, but the spotlight stayed on corn and soy. Those crops consumed over 80% of U.S. farmland by the early 2000s, while the tepery survived quietly on tribal land. However, silence doesn't mean extinction. A few people refused to forget what the desert had taught them. Their next move turned memory into resistance and seeds into rebellion. Across the Sonoran Desert, a few tribal farmers decided that if the world didn't care about the tepery bean, they would bring it back themselves. Around 1996, a community group called Tohono O'odham Community Action, TOCA, began collecting ancient seedlines from elders and forgotten storage jars. Each variety had its own name, flavor, and story. Some hadn't been grown for more than 300 years. Farmers like Terrell Dew Johnson and Sterling Johnson worked by hand. No machines, no chemicals, just desert soil and memory. They called it planting the ancestors. By the early 2000s, they harvested enough to feed families and sell small bags to local schools. The beans turned up in traditional stews, tortillas, and bread again. Elders said the flavor tasted like the desert itself. Kids who had grown up on store-bought food learned how to plant, soak, and cook the same beans their great-grandparents carried through dry seasons. Every seed represented survival. TOCA eventually built a food co-op and partnered with universities to share data, proving the tepery could grow with 75% less water than modern beans. However, the revival went beyond food. It restored identity. Farmers said growing it felt like remembering who we were before the drought. As the crops began to spread again across the Southwest, scientists started paying attention. The old bean that beat heat and hunger was about to find a new purpose. Today, climate models warn that over 30% of global crop yields could fall by 2050 because of rising heat and drought. Yet the tepery bean has already lived through worse. It was born from heat. In fields where corn and soy wither, the tepery stays green, setting pods even at 115 degrees Fahrenheit. Scientists now call it America's survival crop. In 2019, university trials in Arizona and Mexico confirmed what desert farmers always knew. Tepery beans used less than 1/5 the water of soybeans while producing nearly equal protein. That means they could feed families where rainfall barely touches the soil. Some researchers compare its promise to quinoa, which built a global market worth over $8 billion. Yet this cousin from the same family still grows quietly in the background. Governments have started testing it for food security programs, but the real momentum is coming from indigenous farmers. They see it as more than a crop. It's a bridge between the past and the planet's uncertain future. As one elder told researchers, we grow it because it remembers how to live when everything else forgets. Therefore, the story of the tepery bean isn't about rediscovery. It's about recognition. The knowledge was never lost, only ignored. And now, while the world spends billions searching for drought-proof seeds, the answer has been waiting in the desert for 5,000 years. The question is, will we finally listen? Thanks for watching, friend. Ancient crops still whisper their secrets, and every forgotten seed tells a story. Subscribe, stay curious, and join me next time as we uncover what history tried to hide.